Okay. I want to thank the History Department at Cal State San Bernardino, the History Club, and Phi Alpha Theta, as well as the CSUSB Intellectual Life Fund for making this event possible. Thanks to my friends and colleagues and students who are tuning in today, and I hope that you will all help me hosting Mr. Johnson, Ian Johnson, today by sending some excellent questions in the chat. Most importantly, of course, thanks to Ian Johnson for making the time to join us today to share his work with our campus and community in the virtual environment. He's joining us, I'll add, at 6 in the morning from his time zone. So I want to especially thank him for that. We'll focus today on US-China relations, particularly journalism in China today, but our topics, as we'll learn from my introduction of Mr. Johnson, can be quite wide-ranging, and we can hear from him on a number of topics if you want to bring those into the discussion as well. Ian Johnson is a Pulitzer-Prize winning writer whose work has explored themes of society, religion, and history in China, but also in other regions. Wild Grass in 2004, his 2004 book examined how an authoritarian government can keep up with the pressures for change from a rapidly modernizing society where levels of education and prosperity are rising every day. In 2010, he published A Mosque in Munich, which was a ground level look at Cold War spying that centered on a quiet mosque which became Munich radical Islam's first beachhead in the West. It weaves the stories of several key players, a Nazi scholar turned post-war spy master, key Muslim leaders across the globe, including members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and naive CIA men eager to fight communism with a new weapon, Islam. And most recently, his book, The Souls of China, The Return of Religion After Mao in 2017, tells the story of one of the world's great spiritual revivals. Following a century of violent anti-religious campaigns, China is now filled with new temples, churches, and mosques, as well as cults, sects, and politicians trying to harness religion for their own ends. Driving this explosion of faith is uncertainty over what it means to be Chinese, how to live an ethical life in a country that discarded traditional morality a century ago and is still searching for new guideposts. This book is a culmination of a 6-year project following an underground Protestant church in Chengdu, pilgrims in Beijing, rural Taoist priests in Shanxi, and meditation groups in caves in the country's south. And I just read Souls of China over the last month and found it really absolutely delightful, bringing all of the rigor of deep research as well as the accessibility of really fine journalistic writing. I recommend it to everybody, and I'll share some links in the chat in just a minute. He's also contributed chapters to my first trip to China in 2011, Chinese Characters, 2012, and the Oxford Illustrated History of Modern China in 2016. 2020, 2021, he was awarded the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Fellowship for a new book he's writing on China's unofficial history, and we'll all be eagerly awaiting that. Johnson first went to China as a student in Beijing from 1984 to 1985, and then in Taipei from 86 to 88. And he later worked as a newspaper correspondent in China from 94 to 96 with Baltimore's The Sun, and from 97 to 2001 with the Wall Street Journal, where he covered macroeconomics, China's WTO accession, and social issues. In 2009, Johnson returned to China, lived there until 2020 as a writer for the New York Times, New York Review of Books, and other publications, and taught undergraduates at the Beijing Center for Chinese Studies, and has served as an advisor to academic journals and think tanks, such as the Journal of Asian Studies, the Berlin-based think tank MERIX, and the New York University Center for Religion and Media. After being expelled from China in 2020, as part of escalating tensions between Washington and Beijing, Johnson now writes books and is pursuing a PhD at the University of Leipzig on Chinese religious associations. He's also worked in Germany twice. From 88 to 92, he attended graduate school in West Berlin and worked as a freelancer covering the fall of the Berlin Wall, German unification for Baltimore's The Sun, St. Petersburg Times, Toronto Star, and other newspapers. In 2001, he moved back to Berlin, working until 2009 as the Wall Street Journal's Germany bureau chief and senior writer. He headed coverage of European macroeconomics and wrote about social issues such as Islamic terrorism. He has won the Pulitzer-Prize for International Journalism for his coverage of China, as well as 2 awards from the Overseas Press Club and as an award and an award from the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2017, he won the Stanford University's Shorenstein Journal Award for his body of work covering Asia. And in 2019, he won the American Academy of Religion's Best In-Depth News Writing Award. This is, if you believe it, an abbreviated version of Mr. Johnson's extensive accomplishments. I'll share several links for you in the chat again, if anybody wants to click through on those and learn more about his work. And I'll send that several times throughout the meeting because late arrivals won't be able to read previous messages in the chat. Again, if you have questions throughout the meeting, you can send them to me in the chat, and I will collect those and share them with Mr. Johnson after his opening remarks. Again, I want to deeply thank Mr. Ian Johnson for joining us today. And please join me in giving him a virtual welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I see there are questions coming in already. At least I've gotten some questions. So I'm looking forward to talking to everybody virtually, answering your questions. And I thought I would start out a little bit by talking about some of my experiences in China, some of the conclusions that might be drawn from that, and then how I think that impacts China-U.S. relations today. And so I look forward, to your questions and challenges of my assumptions and things like that. I am in the background is a picture of the Temple of Heaven, which I took actually just a year ago before being expelled. And you can see everybody's wearing masks. Of course, in China, people wear masks a lot of the time anyway, but this was just as the coronavirus was starting to really spread and people were all masked up. And little did I know that that would be the last time I would be in China probably for a while. So anyway, I'm going to share a screen here with some sort of a PowerPoint and some pictures. I have tentatively entitled this talk "Losing Perspective" because I think this is something that's been going on with journalism in China and maybe our views of China. And so it might be some sort of framing idea for how to view things. And I wanted to, as I said, just talk a little bit about my experiences in China initially, and then how that informed my views of China, which may or may not be accurate, but I think they do have some relevance for today. And I think the best way to start a lecture like this is with a little bit of humor. So here is a picture of my student ID from Peking University in 1984 when I was 22 years old. I look like I just got out of a waterboarding session or something like that. Actually, I'd just gotten off the plane in Beijing and had this picture taken and had no idea where I was. And that's pretty much been the story of my experience in China since then. And then, this is my student dorm in Beijing. So it was an interesting time to be in China because this was just 8 years after the end of the Cultural Revolution. It was the beginning of the reform and opening period. And you could travel around. There were a lot of places, for example, this temple in China, the White Cloud Temple, which is still a major important temple in Beijing, but there were hardly any people in these places, and many places that have now become giant tourist spots in China were quite empty. I went there to study Chinese, but also to write a senior thesis on North American journalism in China. because at that time I was already interested in journalism and I was hoping to be able to combine my two interests. And so I spent time, besides learning Chinese, also interviewing foreign correspondents who were living in China at the time. So I talked to, bullet point thing here, I talked to journalists from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, AP, Christian Science Monitor, Globe and Mail, and others as well. And I got their perspectives on how they were covering China and the limitations that they had on how to report on China. My conclusion, and very arrogant, that I had at the time, was that there was too much copycat work. That journalists were writing each other's stories half the time. Somebody would do a story on inflation in China and interview Mr. X, and then the next couple days later, other journalists would all go interview Mr. X and write the same story. As I say here, I think it's partially understandable because in the 1980s, it was hard to get outside of Beijing. It was hard to interview people, even to go to somebody's home. You had to sometimes register at the front gate of their compound. Getting onto campuses was difficult. It still is often difficult now, or increasingly difficult to do these kinds of things. But it was objectively quite hard in China back then to report. So people tended to glom on to the same topics. But I do think that this is a theme that we find over and over again in how China is perceived, and that this has almost been exacerbated in the coming years, in recent years. And so my conclusion also is that these lessons were that you should try to get out of Beijing as much as possible and try not to do what everyone else is doing because they've already done it. I returned to China in 1994 and stayed there till 2001 to work as a journalist for the Baltimore Sun and then the Wall Street Journal. The Sun from 94 to 96, and then the Wall Street Journal from 97 to 2001. And I also did a lot of volunteer work at a charity that helped rebuild Taoist temples, which was really helpful for me because it gave me a different perspective on China than just the journalist perspective, which tends to be focused on stories and important topics and stuff like that that get into the news all the time. It's just a word. This is a picture of the old Baltimore Sun. The Baltimore Sun used to be a very important national and international newspaper in the United States. I don't know if you might have heard just the other day, it was transferred to a charity run by a local philanthropist who hopes to revive the newspaper. But it was one of the first, I think it was the first newspaper in the United States to have a foreign correspondent. It was a big industrial port city near Washington, and had, when I was there, a network of correspondents around the world. But because we were so close to Washington, and the Washington Post and the New York Times was just up the street, we were told to get out and not cover what other people wrote about. So they didn't want us writing every speech that the senior leaders said or every kind of major policy announcement, but to cover sort of offbeat topics, which for me was actually much more interesting than being the 10th person to write about Deng Xiaoping's latest pronouncement, or the speculation about, at this point, the speculation whether Deng Xiaoping was still alive or not. So I got to do articles like this on mental health in China. And this was back when newspapers had a lot of money and they could send a correspondent out to China and spend a couple of weeks on an article. They even, if you're a aficionado, if you're looking closely at this article, you can see there's a photographer was assigned to take photos, and they paid a photographer several days to go to different places and take photos, but places maybe where I'd interviewed, such as a hotline and so on and so forth. And so there was a lot of money in journalism still, and there was time and space to report on topics that weren't being covered by everyone else. Got to travel a lot. This was a trip that was sponsored by the government to Xinjiang And these were what we call dog and pony shows, where they're showing you how great everything is in Xinjiang, or in whatever, in a factory, a steel factory, or a this or that, which a lot of journalists look down on. But I found that they were actually quite interesting, because this is the government showing you their version of the best case scenario. And that's often quite revealing, because if this is the best the government can do to show you things, then that also tells you about what's going on. And in this case, when we went to Xinjiang in 1990, I guess it was 1996, we were supposed to stop in several towns, but there were riots in those towns, and so we weren't allowed to stop. So of course, then we didn't get to actually report on the riot, but we did see the tensions there. And so I think those kinds of things are often quite interesting to see, not to dismiss government propaganda, but to look at it closely. I think sometimes journalists say, oh, that's People's Daily, that's just the party mouthpiece or something like that, as if that doesn't matter. I think it really does matter. We have to really understand what the government is telling us, and to look at it, of course, critically, but to look at it carefully. Later, then I went over to the Wall Street Journal, where I was covering more daily news, and there was a lot of daily stuff to write about, such as covering press conferences by senior leaders, such as, in this case, Zhu Rongji, which was also quite revealing, just because it was also a time when senior leaders like Zhu Rongji met the press regularly. They were very fast on their feet. They were very savvy in dealing with the foreign press. I think it was, in some ways, I feel it was a more self-confident time, because the government was willing to open itself up to real questions. Now they do have this once a year press conference, but all the questions are vetted ahead of time, and many foreign journalists just boycott these press conferences. But with the Wall Street Journal, they also said, don't cover what everybody else is covering unless it has to do with economics. But when you're writing features on China, just get out and talk to people, get out of Beijing as much as possible. And so I got to go around to China and light fireworks with kids, which is often a lot of fun. And I did charity work as well, which helped, as I said, get me outside the daily grind. And this charity was set up by this American businessman, the guy on the right, who helped rebuild Taoist temples that were destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. Third time around, I went back to China in 2007 to 2020, first still with the Wall Street Journal, and then starting in 2010, I quit the Wall Street Journal in order to work purely as a freelancer, so I could cover longer term themes and topics that interested me. And so I was accredited. So I had my journalist card and my visa from the New York Times, but I also wrote for the New York Review of Books. That's what NYRB is there, New York Review of Books, and other publications, and tried to write more books and pursue other topics as well, and also taught. I focus more on longer term projects, such as the one I'm working on now, on unofficial histories. In Chinese, that would be Minjian Lishi. Unofficial histories, or popular histories, the history that the government doesn't tell about China, but the history that Chinese people are telling about themselves. And sometimes there's overlap there. But there's often a lot of things that don't make it into the official history books. And so you have a lot of publications in China right now that documentary films, samizdat, so sort of unofficial history journals, books that are published. And despite the crackdown, and this is what my focus is, these are people doing these works nowadays, not 10, 15 years ago, but in the 2010s, despite the tighter political control, people who are still able to do this kind of work. And I think it's important to realize that there are still a lot of Chinese people who are doing interesting work in China. Because I think sometimes when we think of China nowadays, we think of it as in the title of a book that was published a few years ago in China, The Perfect Dictatorship, that somehow through social credit and video surveillance, that China is in complete lockdown. But this is not really the case. yes, certain parts of China are in really tight lockdown, but there's still a lot of things that are being done by Chinese people that are fascinating, interesting, and which we need to understand better. And for example, this reading room that I wrote a piece about recently in Xi'an, where people just get together, they have public lectures, they borrow books. It's not really a library. It's you can't take the books out, but you can read them there. You can also buy some of the books. But it's not really a bookstore. It's just called a cultural space. There are still places like this that exist in China where people get together to think critically. This, for me, launched a series that I did, which is still on the New York Review of Books website, which is a series of Q&As with public intellectuals in China. So these are people who are involved in these unofficial histories, or people who are just pushing the envelope in China, and who are obviously have less access to the public sphere than in the past, or sometimes no access, but they're still making work. They're still in some ways publishing. So these are some of you in the audience who follow these issues will recognize, from top left to right, the journalist Jiang Xue, the sociologist Guo Yuhua, the lecturer Chen Hongguo, the author Hu Faoyun, and then lower left, the videographer Lao Hu Miao, Ai Xiaoming, Hu Jie, and others who are still making films and doing things like this. So I think, what to me, maybe some. Oh yeah, this is also my students. Sorry, that's what I was going to talk about my students. The students are also really helpful because they help me give it, or they used to when I was in China teaching, gave me a different perspective on things. So I think what I think there are several sort of takeaways from these different experiences. And these are sort of growing problems. I think we have to recognize that there has been, obviously, there are long-term tensions between China and the United States that are not going to go away despite the Biden administration taking office. People who blame everything on the Trump administration, I think, are ignoring the fact that there has been a growing tightening in China over the past decade, which has taken away a lot of space for people in the public sphere. Things were never perfect, but it has gotten a lot tighter, a lot harder. And I think some sort of a backlash was inevitable. But there are some things still worth reflecting on. I think that this reporting that I was doing in the past, this sort of grassroots reporting, oh, sorry, this is actually wrong. It says it does fit. It should be does not fit the flame war mentality of social media. Right now, so much of our discussion on China and on many topics, let's face it, you name it, you can domestic issues in the United States or not, has this gotcha, let me make a point on social media and burn you, and then I'll get a lot of likes from other people who think like me. I'll get retweeted a lot. My number of followers will go up. But we're speaking in siloed worlds, right? I get you, you get me, but we're not convincing anybody on social media. And sort of the type of work that I tried to do, and that I think we need more of in China, is only really possible if we take a step back and engage with China as much as possible, go to China as much as possible, even though I know it's harder. And as somebody who was expelled from China, it's not, I recognize obviously the problems in this, but I think we need to be more inside China, reporting on things from the grassroots as much as possible, and less interested and making op-ed style zinger points. I think that a lot of current day politics, and this is not just at all in the United States, it is driven more by ideology than pragmatism. I think now it's seen as a sign of weakness if you're pragmatic, or if you're willing to take a step back. And I think this is one of the reasons, for example, why the Biden administration will have difficulty in undoing some of the measures that the Trump administration did, which I think should be undone. And some of these issues, for example, are ending, and this might be changed pretty quickly, but ending the Fulbright program, ending the Peace Corps in China. Many of these now will require Chinese agreement to restart these projects. But these kinds of projects, which I think had been very helpful, need to be restarted. Trying to reopen consulates rather than closing consulates, trying to get journalists back into China. These were things that the United States had, and then out of spite sort of cut them off. And I think it will be harder now to restart them. It's not like the United States can just unilaterally restart all these programs. And there may be pushback from China, and China may not be willing to restart all of them. But I think there should be much more of an effort to do that. I'm not even sure that the Biden administration will be able to without being seen as being weak. So they may push on one or two of them, but it's going to be hard, I think, across the board. I just, as this example of the problems we face, last year when the consulate in Chengdu was closed in response to the Wuhan, the outbreak of the virus in Wuhan and various other things, the U.S. government closed the consulate in Chengdu, and it was actually in response to spying allegations. And then the Chinese government closed its consulate in Houston, right? I said on Twitter there that, and I wrote an article saying that this was basically an eye for an eye kind of policy, that we shouldn't have more of this. We should try to keep as many consulates open as possible. And somebody who was sort of well known in the field came back and said, we don't need to know what these consulates can tell us. We just need the right standpoint to understand China. So in other words, we don't need information coming from the ground up that consulates can give you. We just need to have the right ideological view, and then we can understand China. That's all that matters. And I think this is exactly wrong. Obviously, we need to have a moral backbone. We need to have certain basic principles that guide our interactions with China, but we need the grassroots, bottoms-up information, and we can't do that if we close down consulates and expel journalists. So I kept my comments short because I know there's a lot of questions. Maybe just a couple of quick final comments. I think the 1980s was a really open time when I was there. In the 1990s, when I was there was this belief that economics would liberalize China. And then in the 2000s, there was this idea that the internet would liberalize China. There was sort of this series of magic bullets that were supposed to liberalize China. And then I think since then, we've had this sense of disillusionment. And some of it is completely justified, but I think some of it is also, we are facing the fact that it is harder, that China will change much more slowly than we imagine, or it may not change, and that this has caused a backlash. And I think Trump was just the most extreme manifestation of this. As I said, Biden's unlikely to roll back a lot of these, but I think it's a mistake. We need more and not less engagement. So there's some contact information for me. If we don't get a chance to talk in the Q&A, you can feel free, for example, to send me an email or a message. I'm always happy to talk. So with that, I will stop my prepared comments, and we can open the floor up.
Thank you so much, Ian. We got a couple questions coming in. I want to briefly pull rank, if that's okay, and ask a question about the Falun Gong, because 20 years ago, it was your coverage of the Falun Gong that earned you the Pulitzer. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the trajectory of the Falun Gong on its own terms, but also in relation to Beijing. But more recently, through organs like the Epoch Times, the American right and the Trump administration. And you had a great story in the New York Times about this. And I think this is seems to be a new development, or well, I'm not sure how new the development is. Actually, I'll put that to you. But the trajectory of the Falun Gong over the past 20 years or so, could you, in a nutshell, sort of briefly update our understanding of the Falun Gong?
Yeah, well, when Falun Gong rose up, it was in the 1990s, and there was this mass movement in China called Qigong, which people who are interested in alternative forms of healing or meditation exercise are probably still familiar with Qigong. It's itself a neologism. It's a new kind of amalgam of different spiritual practices that have been practiced in China for a long time, using energy channeling through your body with some ideas that people may be familiar with from Chinese medicine. Falun Gong was one of these Qigong groups that rose up in the 1990s. There were several of them, and there were many people who practiced Qigong. In fact, if you went to a park in the 1980s and 90s in China, you couldn't help but see people who were practicing kinds of Qigong in the parks, just like nowadays you see people practicing Tai Chi and stuff like that. Falun Gong was the most organized of these groups. It had its own cosmology. It had its leader published books. And it was the most militant of the Qigong groups. It clashed with the government in 1999. The government banned it. And then there was a fierce crackdown, which is what I wrote about for the Wall Street Journal. And this included sending thousands of people to the prison, to labor camps, and police brutality, which killed upward of 100 people for failing to renounce Falun Gong. So I think we have to see Falun Gong as a kind of new religion, a new kind of Chinese religion, spiritual practice. I mean, they would often say they were not a religion. It depends how you want to define what a religion is, but a new spiritual group practice, and the government cracked down on it. Now, Falun Gong was always run, as I said, in a very militant, very top-down hierarchical fashion by a enigmatic leader who even back then was living in New Jersey, Li Hongzhi from China. And when it was banned in China, many people fled abroad, and it had followers abroad, primarily among overseas Chinese communities. And they launched a newspaper called Epoch Times, and also a satellite television network called New Tang Dynasty Television, which I think is still available, and you can still find. At the time, it was sort of an interesting platform because it was published in several languages, and they had several mainstream, I say mainstream, sort of dissidents in exile who sometimes wrote pieces for it. They posited problems in the Communist Party, and much more so than any dissident group had done. They kept together despite the troubles of being in exile. You know, when groups go into exile, they often end up squabbling and breaking apart, and then you never hear from them again. But Falun Gong, maybe because it is bound together in this hierarchical, strong, tight organization, it kept going, and it's still going. Over the past few years, they've adopted more and more right-wing positions to the point where they became, they set up almost clickbait type things to push alt-right QAnon style conspiracy theories about the election being rigged in the United States. And some of it initially you could sort of understand because Trump was taking a hardline position against China, and many dissidents supported Trump's position, saying, hey, finally somebody recognizes the CCP for what it is, and we need to stand up. And you can understand that. But increasingly, I think this goes way beyond that, to taking essentially nutty, indefensible positions. And I don't know where it goes from here, but it seems to be much more a creature of American far-right politics now than it is of China. But that's, I think, where it is now. Now, there's still people who practice Falun Gong, and for them it is still just a spiritual practice. And I think we shouldn't forget that Falun Gong was a victim of the crackdown in China, and there's still Falun Gong people who occasionally in China get arrested and stuff like that. But it has morphed into something really quite strange, and I think there's almost another book to be written in that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go more or less chronologically then through, because James Wasserman was the first to weigh in with a question. What are your observations about how journalism is taught in China? How do educated Chinese citizens rationalize the principles of journalism with the government's national goals? I also want to just remind our attendees that if you would like to ask your question live, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and that should be in the reactions tab there on the lower right. I think it should be of your toolbar. So if you want to ask your question live, you should go ahead and raise your hand. And again, I apologize for the draconian policies, but we had some Zoom bombing issues over the past couple of weeks. And as it sounds like graffiti, but it ain't. It's a little more disturbing. And so I want to encourage everybody to go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like, or continue sending your questions. And I believe, Ian, you can see the questions as well. Is that right, as they come in?
I can, yeah.
Great, thanks.
So yes, on that first question, that's a great question. I mean, journalism, there has been some great journalism in China over the past decades, especially in the 2000s when the internet was new, relatively new, and it was not quite under government control. It was still, the government was still figuring out how to control the internet without killing it. I think they were smart enough to realize they didn't want to kill it because they saw this as a platform for business and stuff like that. So there was a period when a lot of newspapers were online. There was a lot of great work that was being done by journalists, investigative work that revealed police abuse and other issues like that. And so you can see that people, young journalists in China, people who are interested in journalism, even today, are very idealistic. They do get what journalism is all about, but in terms of how it's taught in China, it's taught often much more as I think the technology, or let's say the technique aspect is taught more. In Chinese, the fangfa, the sort of methods of having the best equipment, having the latest high definition digital cameras, and teaching people how to use that and how to cut and splice and how to do multimedia projects and stuff like that is put at a premium. And I don't know if it's still the case, but there used to be, Western, say, retired TV journalists who would go and teach all the latest know-how. But the social aspect, that journalism is supposed to be sort of an estate in society that is equal to the government and can stand up to it, et cetera, that of course is not taught. I think people, though, a lot of journalists get this because they can look back over Chinese history or in other places and they can see the role. It doesn't have to be necessarily a journalist, but the role of the public intellectual in Chinese history. Some of the most famous people in Chinese history have been people who acted kind of like journalists and stood up to the government, like famous historians and officials and so on. So I think there's this contradiction and conflict between idealistic journalists and a state that does not want idealistic journalists will continue even if the government doesn't teach the social role of journalism.
Thanks, Ian. I have Greg DePeace, former classmate at UCSD, a historian of Japan, who's asked about the Confucius Institutes. I'd be interested in hearing your take on Confucius Institutes, which are the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Hanban sort of satellite institutions that are often connected to colleges, sometimes high schools and other organizations. And I think funded 50% by the Chinese government.
I don't know the exact funding, but yeah, no, they're clearly run by the Chinese government. I don't have a problem with the Confucius Institutes if we treat them and recognize them for what they are. A lot of governments many major states have similar things. Germany has the Goethe Institute, the UK has the British Council. The United States used to have things in Europe. They used to have one in Berlin, an iconic post-Cold War building called the America House, which showed American films and had a lending library and things like that. The Alliance Française, the Cervantes Institute. And that's fine if you recognize it as essentially a propaganda institute of the countries in question. I think the most successful of these are quite self-critical. So if you go to the Goethe Institute, you'll see things on the plight of Turkish guest workers, you'll see critical artists. And so you'll come out of that kind of experience thinking, wow, Germany is an interesting country because they can even show me a film about Turkish guest workers who are having troubles and stuff like that. If it's just something on, here's how to make, schnitzel or something like that, or here's how to learn German, or here's what the Oktoberfest is like in Germany, then I think it's less successful and people aren't that interested in it. I think this is maybe the real problem the Confucius Institutes had. One problem was the content problem, is that it often tends to be kind of anodyne stuff about Chinese culture and so on and so forth, which isn't necessarily really that interesting at the end of the day. And secondly, it's that some universities were using them, or maybe still are using them, to offer accredited courses, especially accredited language courses. And so it was sort of this idea, I have a turnkey operation here. I don't have a Chinese language program, but they're going to come in and teach accredited courses. Now that's a problem. I think universities have to be academically independent. And you can say, well, if it's just Chinese 101, you're just learning ni hao ma, how are you, and stuff like that. Does it really matter who's teaching it? But I think on some level it does matter, because all textbooks are not chosen by you. Textbooks have messages also, and it bleeds pretty quickly into propaganda. So I think that is a problem, and that has to be viewed critically. When I was working more in Germany, we used money from the Confucius Institute to bring over some religious organizations, actually, to perform. They were also music groups, and they came over and partially funded by the Confucius Institutes. They gave performances and lectures, but the Confucius Institutes in Germany were not part of the university. They were separate organized clubs that were off campus. And so in that sense, I think it was okay. But I think they have to be, you just have to know what they are and then treat them like that.
Thanks. And as a California state institution, it's tricky to have that conversation as well, because if you look at the endowment of I know University of Chicago and Toronto had different sort of conversations a few years ago, and it's a different perspective when you have different kinds of endowments, but that's a really nice way to consider it. Lee Moore has a question, and Lee's hand is raised, and Lee is next in line. So I'm going to go ahead and see if we can unmute Lee, see if that works. Lee, can you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you, Mr. Johnson, for speaking with us. I was wondering what specific examples of troubles with reporting you could give from the period before you actually were expelled. Like, I mean, is there anything that kind of specifically embodies this is how journalists, non-Chinese journalists, are treated in China in 2020 or 2019? And what do you see in general going forward? How will non-Chinese journalists deal with working and reporting on China?
Yeah, I didn't get to too many of the problems, and so that's a great question. I mean, the problems, I think, on the side of the journalists, and this is not specific to China, but it's something you see around the world, it's the destructive effect of social media, the Me Too copycat issue. So not Me Too in terms of the Me Too movement, but in terms of somebody's written something and somebody else says, oh, I better write that too, because they've immediately tweeted it. And then the editors back home see all this and they think, oh, we need to have that article too. And so you're constantly getting rockets sent back from the headquarters in New York or wherever it is, Berlin or something like that, saying, well, we need a piece on that too. So everybody sort of, just like in the 1980s, everyone's sort of copying each other because of social media. And I think journalists spend way too much time on social media, in this social media echo chamber, and sort of preaching to the choir on that. And they should spend more time out on the ground. Now that the problems in terms of from the government side, the restrictions on journalists have been increasing. This has been well documented by the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, FCCC. If you go to their website, they have annual reports on working conditions in China, which you can download. The most common problems are restrictions to areas such as going to Xinjiang, places that are open officially, so they're not a military restricted area, and you can theoretically get on a plane or a train or rent a car and go there. But the moment you show up, you're tailed. Or the moment you arrive at the airport, there's a welcome committee of people who are then following you around. And that has been a growing problem. And then I think the other big problem has been the use of the restrictions on visas. So this is not just people being kicked out like I was, but people, because I was kicked out as part of a tit for tat thing. So it wasn't specifically about my coverage, but there are people whose coverage has been quite critical. For example, my former colleague at the Times, Chris Buckley, who's an excellent reporter on Chinese politics. Chris was on a series of sort of 3-month, 2-month visas. They wouldn't give him a 12-month visa. And because you have to start applying for your new visa 4 weeks ahead of time, and you have to be in country, if you're just given a 2-month visa, you're basically all the time applying for a visa. He couldn't leave the country at all to go see his family. And even now, the journalists who are in China, for example, Keith Bradsher, who is one of, I think, the only reporter left for the New York Times, he hasn't been able to leave China and go visit his family in over a year because they keep saying, we don't know if we'll give you a new visa when you try to come back, because they won't give him a 12-month visa. They just keep sort of extending it on these short-term things. So they use visas as a weapon. And of course, this was what the Trump administration was reacting to and why they then expelled the Chinese journalists. But that's a different topic. But this is, I think, the kind of thing. The government in China, I think it used to accept journalists as part of the cost of doing business, of we're open to the world. We don't like what these journalists are saying, but who cares? And we'll even try to win them over, maybe. We'll have press conferences with them. We'll meet them occasionally. Xi Jinping's never met. I don't think he's ever met a foreign journalist, or maybe one journalist in the past decade. Whereas when I was with the Wall Street Journal in the 1990s, we actually met Zhu Rongji when the CEO of Dow Jones came over. We went and met him and talked to him, had a one-on-one interview with him. Those sort of things don't exist anymore. I think the government used to accept that, but is now much more thin-skinned, and is now, well, if we don't like you, and we're just basically going to try to squeeze you out, because there's no downside. The world will still do business with us, and if there are no foreign journalists in China, who cares? So I think there's that growing feeling from the side of Beijing, that they can just sort of limit journalists, kick them out, and there'll be no cost.
Thanks, Ian. I see we have a hand up, but I think in the queue there were 3 questions. There are about 5 questions in the queue. 3, and then we'll go with Sherman. So just a quick who's on deck. It's Xinfan, and then Christoph, and then Mike. Xinfan's question is, I'm curious about how Mr. Johnson balances his journalistic work with his academic pursuit at Leipzig. Is he adaptable to Chicago citation style? My students will be interested in that. How does his previous field knowledge contribute to his academic future?
Yeah, exactly. That's my biggest question is, what software should I use to write my paper? Or should I just keep using Word, which I've been doing, which is not very efficient, I think, in terms of like citations and stuff like that. Well, how do I balance it? Because I've been kicked out of China. I started my PhD before being kicked out of China, but I have more time on my hands now. So I guess I viewed academic work as a way to really do a deeper dive in a way that journalism and magazine writing didn't allow, and to engage with some of the interesting theoretical issues that surround about how we look at associations in China, how we look at civil society in China, and to really finally do all the reading, which I've never quite done, or done in a much more autodidactic way. And this forces me to more systematically do the reading and do the work and really know the state of the field. So that's how I guess the compliment is that in Leipzig and in Germany, they still have the discipline of sinology, like Sino, like Chinese studies, and you can do a PhD. And this is sort of considered passe in North America, where you're supposed to be in a discipline, like I should be in the history department, or I should be in the sociology department, or I should be in the whatever department. I guess if my political science, if I were in if I were in a North American university, I would be either in the history or the anthropology ethnography department. And I think as a journalist, I did a lot of interviews with people. And so a lot of my work is based on interviews. And so I think I'm maybe in some ways, or that's one of my skills, and also being able to write more quickly. Because I mean, a lot of people, when they do their PhD, it's their first big project that they've written in their life, right? So it's really hard. It's this arduous project, and they have to struggle with it for quite a while, just the writing process. Whereas I think I'm a little more able to focus on it and say, okay, I can do this. I just need to get the framework figured out. I need to know, what am I trying to say with all this material? What is my point trying to be? So that's, for me, the struggle. But the, say, more technical side of writing it all down, and the interview process is not as difficult.
Thanks, Ian. We've got Christoph next, and then Mike Chow, and then I'll ask Sherman to unmute just a minute. Christoph Mueller-Hofstede says, is it still possible to get information on offbeat topics from China, from people you have been in contact with while still in China? If possible, is it possible to speak about this? And I caught your conversation with Kaiser Kuo from just a few weeks ago. Actually, I think that's a nice outlet for this kind of news. But please go ahead.
Well, I think it's possible still when you're overseas to find offbeat, interesting things about China, but it's no substitute at all for being on the ground. And I don't want to be somebody who's telling people what it's like in China, 5 years from now, when I haven't been to China in 5 years. I mean, maybe I'll be able to go back to China, I don't know. But I think that's also this is a problem of having fewer boots on the ground, fewer eyes inside China, is that we don't know things as well, the nuances, the different things you get. My impressions, for example, of how China handled the COVID lockdown was informed by being there during the lockdown period. And that was, a bit different in that there were draconian things. If you just look at social media, you tend to just see the draconian aspect of it, the fact that there were barricades around villages, or people sitting like it was the Middle Ages with a stick in front of their village, like, don't enter my village, and that sort of thing. And it was all true, but overwhelmingly, when I was in China and talking to people in China, it was voluntary, because the government actually did a pretty good job in selling that this was a serious issue, and that it wasn't like they had armed soldiers walking up and down the streets telling people to stay at home. There was a draconian aspect that would be hard to duplicate in other countries, but just being there, you could see that a lot of it, and my friends and so on, they were willing to stay home. They weren't being forced. So that was important, just to have seen that, and that's harder to convey when you're abroad. So I think it's so important to be in China and to get there in any way. Just as a society. I mean, forget what are they calling it? Is it track 2 diplomacy? The academic exchanges, the students going there to study. Just having that experience is so important. I used to be in charge of this program from Loyola University in Chicago, where we had students spend their junior year, they spent 1 semester in Rome and 1 semester in Beijing. They compared a topic. And then for their senior year, they went home and wrote their senior thesis on that. And the students inevitably said, Rome was great. Rome is beautiful. I loved being in Rome. It's a great place. But China was really a life changer. It was changed the way. I'd never been to a country like China before. It was completely different from what I'd experienced, and it opened my eyes to a different part of the world. And I think that's just going there, even for a semester, can help open people's eyes. So I think it's so important to get people back to China if possible.
Thanks, Ian. Mike Chow asks, sorry if we covered this, he joined a little bit late, but how much is China's current geopolitical stance a matter of their long-term strategic goals, and how much of it is attributed to the cult of personality of Xi Jinping?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's the long-term geopolitical goals are not related to Xi Jinping overall. I think you could say that. I mean, Xi Jinping is the most powerful, dynamic leader that China has had in a few generations. And that is for a variety of reasons that we can go into, but he's able to pull all the levers of power in China that other leaders maybe didn't have. For example, Hu Jintao. Xi Jinping, as the scion of a very powerful family in China, he knows all the people that matter. He's part of this sort of, I don't know, several hundred families that are just so important in running the country. What some people provocatively call, like a red nobility. And so he's able to get things done in ways that other leaders were not able to as much. So you see him implementing policy much more forcefully. But around the world, when you look at China pursuing things, for example, in the South China Sea, this is the result of a decades-long systematic buildup of the military. China has a blue water navy and aircraft carriers, not because Xi Jinping ordered it in 2012, but because they started laying the groundwork for this 20, 30 years ago. And we always noted when China would release its budget in the 1990s and 2000s that military spending was going up by double digits every year. But it used to be at such a pathetically low level that people would go, okay, so it's 500 million, now it's 550 million. But we all know the power of compounded interest or something. So you just keep doing 10% a year or 7% a year and you double, right? You just keep doubling and doubling and doubling. And now China's spending a lot on the military. But this is the result of a long-term strategy to make China back into a global power. Not necessarily to dominate the whole world and rule the world or something like that, but China, the government sees China as having been a great power in the past, and its role, its historic mission, one of its historic missions is to restore China's place in the world as a global power. And that involves having aircraft carriers, and the United States leads the way, right? You've got to have all this stuff. You've got to have Mars probes. You've got to do all of these things. That's part of you being the BMOC, big man on campus, or something like that. So this is part of it, and so it's a long-term strategy.
Thanks, Ian. We'll try a live question from Sherman. Sherman, I'm going to go ahead and see if you'd like to unmute. There you go.
Hi, Ian. It's Lee Barkman. I was wondering what you think about using WeChat these days. I find with my friends over there, I try to basically keep things innocuous, but I can also, kind of push them. I mean, if I start asking questions about the election or politics, I feel like they almost feel like they have to, show that they're not afraid. And the last thing I want to do is get anybody in trouble. How closely do you think individual conversations are watched in WeChat, and how dangerous do you think it is for the people over there?
Well, I think with WeChat, you always have to assume that it's monitored or could be monitored, right? We used to joke when we were foreign correspondents in the 1990s and we were using our telephones from the diplomatic compounds where we had to live, that they could monitor some of the people some of the people all the time, all of the people some of the time, but not all the people all the time. And because, you know, there may be limitations in language ability. So if we were on our telephones talking to each other, they may not even have enough native level English speakers who could follow what we were saying, right? But I think obviously with artificial intelligence and different kinds of software, you can monitor much more effectively. I mean, little things like I have these funny emojis, you know, these like GIF type emojis that people use on WeChat to send to each other. And if I'm sending it to some friends, like other foreigners, I can send these kind of funny emojis of Jiang Zemin doing something funny, like he's got some sticks that he's juggling up and down in the air or something like that. If I send it to other people, like to a Chinese person, they're blocked. So this is like, you know, not paranoia. I mean, really, this is really true. And they said, and I'll say, what did you think of that emoji, or what do you want to call those things? And the stickers, right? And they'll say, I didn't get it. I didn't see anything. What did you send me? And it's just blocked. So clearly, some of these stickers, they probably just say, okay, these two goofy foreigners can send to each other whatever they want. Maybe there's some kind of, but other people can't get it. So I think the level of monitoring is sophisticated. And I would assume this goes for the audio chats also, because the audio chats you can convert to text now on WeChat. So obviously they can convert it to text, they can monitor it. Now I suppose it's different if you're speaking in real slangy language or with a heavy accent or something like that. Maybe it's harder for them to figure stuff out. I would assume things can be monitored. And so I wouldn't, if I were talking to somebody and I really wanted to ask something sensitive, then I would, and that person would probably in that case maybe have some kind of another app. I would then try to go to Signal or something like that that's encrypted and not put anything compromising. And as you say, the thing isn't the risk to me, but it's to the other person. That's always the problem.
Thanks, Ian. And thanks, Sherman, Lee, for the question. Catherine Hunt asks about a China Daily story. China Daily published a headline last week about success with poverty alleviation measures in a sample city, maybe Guangzhou. What are some of those measures? And I'll just note for the audience, we have about 10, 11 minutes remaining in our time.
So, well, I think they do have this big push, right? They're supposed to have eliminated, the government's push has been to eliminate poverty by now. And there's been obviously the government will claim success, and then there's discussion which you can find in China about what is your definition of poverty. I think it's quite low, $2 a day, I think, which I'm not sure if it even meets the World Bank definition of poverty. Clearly, the government's making a big effort. I think you can have discussions inside China about things like the benchmark, how successful it is, how sustainable it is. That's another thing. There were so many transfer payments being made that people were, you're just throwing money at people and then their income increased. And then you can say, okay, they're out of poverty. But I mean, does that really eliminate the causes of poverty? So I think it's significant. It's still significant that the government is making an effort at these kinds of things, that they are building roads to poor areas. These things actually do matter. It's not all just propaganda and PR. They are trying to figure things out, but I think at some point, but yes, there is a large element of propaganda involved in this as well.
Thanks, Ian. From Tali Hershkovitz, a two-part question. The Bookworm, the bookstore in Beijing, closed a couple of years ago because of crackdowns on so-called illegal structures. This was obviously a major loss for Beijing's literary and journalistic community. Can cultural centers like the one you've mentioned in Xi'an actually survive under the current crackdown climate? And a second question, can you speak a little about your academic work on Chinese religious associations? And might this work take you back to China?
No, I think the crackdown on public spaces is real. The group I mentioned in Xi'an, they had to temporarily, who knows, close because of COVID restrictions, and they've moved this online and they've reopened partially, but they are under pressure as well. The Bookworm was maybe special because it was more of a foreigner hangout, although not entirely. It was a huge loss, but it was, yeah. The other group that I mentioned was that other place. I think outside of Beijing, there's a little bit more leeway, but no, all these places are under pressure. In terms of my academic work, yeah, I did all the field work already for it on religious associations, how they interact with the government, and the role they have. But I do hope to go back to China in the future to do more work, but we'll have to see how things pan out. I really can't judge.
Thanks, Ian. From Marco Swedeking, which sounds like a real nitty-gritty journalism question, a new journalism question. How effective do you think that social networks such as Facebook or Twitter are in spreading your stories and articles?
I think they do help, but they're often preaching to the choir. I mean, you reach other like-minded people on social media. And I know they try to change the algorithm, so it isn't always like that, but pretty much that's the case. So, yeah, I mean, it's seen as sort of the thing you have to do. Media organizations feel it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you want reporters to promote their articles on social media, and you get followers on social media by taking outrageous positions. So if I sort of say, death penalty for Xi Jinping or something like that, you'll get like a gazillion followers, but that would be also sort of destructive to my credibility, as a journalist, if I were like, well, he's the guy that wants Xi Jinping executed or something like that. So I mean, that's the problem of social media. And then you have some journalists who take real advocacy positions, and you say, well, that person really has such a strong advocacy position, then can I trust them to be giving some kind of quasi, or at least an attempt at an objective version of events? So it's really a fine line that journalists have to walk on social media. I mean, if you just want to do advocacy, that's fine. Then just go out there and say, I'm for clean water, and I'm going to write about clean water, and I'm going to take on big companies that are polluting water, and I'm going to tweet about that. That's a different thing. But if you're trying to write about environmental issues for a major newspaper, and you're supposed to be, not that there are always two sides of the story and that the two sides are equal and things like that, but that you're trying to, that readers can feel they're getting a credible article, then you have to be careful on social media.
Thanks, Ian. To David Swisstock, thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today. I was curious if there was an equivalent to the Baltimore Sun, to more eccentric, offbeat news, similar to a question that came in, I think, after David submitted that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the sad thing is that all the regional newspapers in the United States that used to have foreign bureaus, the Chicago Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer, Miami Herald, Baltimore Sun, they closed pretty much all of their foreign, well, I think you can say blanket say all of their foreign bureaus were closed. I think now if you want to go for more offbeat things, you have to look online for different sites that have different kinds of articles. You can, the problem is sometimes quality varies because there's a lack of gatekeeper functions. And I know people in the past used to always bemoan the gatekeeper function of the media, that the big media dominated the discourse and alternative voices couldn't get out there. But there was, to some degree, a quality control, at least in editing. I mean, sometimes you think there isn't even spell check that's run on some of the articles that are put on blogs, but there are good pieces. You see it. Well, the major newspapers still have good stuff. Vox or Sup China, they will also have different kinds of articles that you can find. I mean, I think you can just by looking around. I use Twitter pretty much as a feed for interesting articles. So I use it kind of like a wire service. So I follow people who are providing me new articles and new ways of finding offbeat things. I don't go on Twitter to have flame wars with people. So if you use social media like that to start following some people who you find interesting and who are recommending interesting pieces, then you can find those articles.
Thanks, Ian. And I sent a couple of those in the chat there for you, David. Brian Spivey says, thanks for this talk. It's been great. I believe the number of American students studying abroad in China has gone down year on year since about 2010, 2011. What do you think is behind this? And is there anything we can do on our side to arrest and reverse this trend? Or is it more in the hands of the Chinese government? Maybe more generally, how do we improve the Anglophone public's understanding of China under these new, more restrictive and authoritarian conditions at a time when that understanding is never more important? Fewer journalists, fewer students, fewer researchers.
Yeah, the number of students has gone down. I used to teach, as Jeremy mentioned before, I taught at this place called the Beijing Center for Chinese Studies, which was an undergraduate study abroad center for historically Catholic universities in the US. And we had students, I guess, it peaked at sort of 150 students who were studying there around the Olympics. And then it went into a slow glide decline. And then of course, COVID ended all the students going overseas. But this was part of, I think, the story, the narrative about China went from, oh, China is this rising, cool country, or may have a lot of problems, but still, blah, 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 in the 2000s, right, going up to the Olympics. And then the story changed to air apocalypse. It was really polluted. You can't believe how many students would say, oh, I don't know if I want to go there because, the air is bad. And you could say, oh, come on, just for a few months, you're not going to get lung cancer. But there were issues like that. And then the worsening human rights situation, China has become more of a important country. It used to be people would go there kind of like they'd go to a cool country, people who were not interested necessarily in China. You were just a business major and you wanted to go abroad for a semester. You could choose going to Florence, or you could choose going to Bangkok, or you could choose going to Beijing or Tokyo. And you choose Beijing because Beijing, China had a buzz around it. It was interesting and it was rising and seemed really like a cool place to go. And now I think that kind of aspect is off because China doesn't have such a great story. So, when Xi Jinping often says we should tell China's story well, part of it is China has to have a good story to tell. I mean, it isn't just about high-speed rail and stuff. When you jail your Nobel Prize laureate and he dies in prison, that's a hard thing to overcome. It's not just a PR problem, like you got to get the right PR firm to help out. You also have to have a better story to tell. So I think this is part of the problem. Now, I think part of it is I think we have to get people to realize that going to China is still a really cool thing to do. And I think it is really interesting, an interesting place to go. The students who went to the Beijing Center always thought it was sort of better than they expected. It is still a fun place to go to. You can still travel around and see a lot of cool things. It's a different experience. And it's very familiar to go to a place like Florence, or even nowadays, Tokyo or Bangkok. You've got your Instagrammable moments that are all sort of cut out for you. But going to a place like China can still be a game changer for many people in their life. And so I would encourage people to go. It's still a cool place to go to.
Thanks, Ian. We're at quarter after the hour, so I do want to wrap up soon because that was our target. We have just 2 more questions, and I think we'll call it at that. And if anybody has any last-minute comments, we can maybe do a sweep. But Jonathan Ellman and then Janelle Pineda Salazar will ask a live question. Jonathan's question is, I've seen the Chinese government claiming to be democratic. Naturally, this is derided, but it does seem to care about and even canvass public opinion. Could you say a bit about that? In particular, how much does the CCP care about public opinion?
Yeah, no, they do care about public opinion. They don't want the media to be the feedback mechanism. So after the virus erupted in Wuhan a year ago, citizen journalists went to Wuhan and began broadcasting and writing and blogging about the lack of PPE and other things there, the crises in the hospitals, the doctors who were freaking out. They were closed down really quickly. So the government does not want that kind of public opinion, but they still want to know what people are thinking. They have a lot of internal opinion polls that they commission. They have internal feedback mechanisms. You can question rightfully whether this works very well. There's still a lot of mistakes that are made, but this is how they view it. They view it as something that the party has to control carefully. So, for example, in the poverty alleviation, you can have a sort of technical discussion about the level that for the definition of what poverty should be, how much you should earn a day, etc. But you can't get out there and show massive hypocrisy or government waste in the anti-poverty alleviation program.
Thank you so much, Ian. And that actually does wrap things up. I made a mistake in thinking there were more questions, but that is, those are all the questions we've had in. I'm really glad we were able to bring such a nice group together. Lots of familiar names, and hopefully sometime soon we'll all be getting together in person. And I want to, although I also do want to really express my appreciation to Ian Johnson for joining us from the other side of the world, starting at 6 o'clock in the 5:45 in the morning, I should say. It's really been absolutely wonderful to be able to speak with you, to meet you virtually here, and especially to share your work with my students. And if you have any closing thoughts, I'll turn it over to you, and then we will wrap up.
Yeah, I'm just picking up my computer, and I'm going to take off the virtual background, which is a bar in Singapore. And that is the reality in Singapore. It is daytime already. So we started at 6 o'clock in the morning, and now the sun has risen. And so it's been great talking to you from Singapore. And I look forward to meeting some of you in person. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me a note or email or something like that. I'm happy to answer questions. So with that, thanks very much, and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'll wrap up. We got lots of claps and thumbs up, and hopefully those will be live and in person next time we have the chance to gather. Thanks to everybody for joining today, I hope you'll join us next week. We'll talk to Ryan Ho Kilpatrick on Monday, a Hong Kong reporter. The day after that, Rana Mitter. So keep track of our CSUSB lecture series, and I hope you join us again soon. Thank you so much, Ian Johnson, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Bye-bye, everybody.